Okay. So, and then if I do this, that should be good.
Wow.
That's perfect.
Gold border here lets you know that you're sharing that.
Okay.
So that's what it'll be seeing the video here.
Okay, that's good.
Yeah. Let's try it too. There we go. Just I wanted to show you that just to make sure that
Okay, you can have our screen there.
So as you can see here, starts off with this title card.
Okay. So, like, do that or come and help me?
What's that? Yeah, you can do it because for your picture, the T is in J, right?
Yeah. So for after I record it, in other words, like,
so because you have something going on immediately after this, right?
No.
Oh, you don't? Okay, cool. So then all you need to do is a little window will pop up here saying Skype Recording Manager. I'll just leave the window open here for you right now. All it'll do is it'll take a while. It'll take several minutes to get it going. But you'll see the status here, and then you can just hit play or browse. For example, this one here, you hit browse.
I can't save it.
You'll be able to see it's right here in this folder.
Okay.
And you
so
can
it's automatically save it. I'm not going to lose the file.
Yep, you just got to leave the computer online and like on your account. So you're just going to have to like sit here and chill for 5-10 minutes after class. So that's cool to do. And then it'll bring it here automatically. Then you can upload it to Google Drive or like put it on a flash drive or whatever you want to do. Okay?
Yes.
All right.
Thank you.
I will take Control F5, right?
No, I think.
Sorry, I thought it was nothing about this part at the end, so yeah. Go back to the Skype for Business window for me. Yep. Just want to make sure. Yep, that one. Yep, still recording. Just want to make sure.
It's recording.
Yep. All right, you should be good to go.
Thank you so much.
Give us a call if you have any problems, okay? Yeah.
So, all right. Do you guys hear me? No. Do you hear me? Do you hear me? So everybody hears me. Is it correct? Okay, good. So let's start, actually. I think let me quickly say that I'm humbled to be here, and it's great that we are going to do this. And thank you all to be here. I want to also take the time to take this opportunity to mention that I'm grateful to working with this wonderful group of colleagues in this semester. So I was thinking, how should I do it? As you know, the French term lecture or lecture means reading. So I thought it's perhaps better if I read it for you in the fashion of actually art historian that they always read their lectures. Then I thought that two problems would occur. One is that after 10 minutes, somebody from back up there perhaps would yell, Ehsan, can you please be nice and read it in a lower pitch. Don't you see that people here are taking their nap? So that was one problem. The second, and perhaps more delightful problem, would be that somebody from down here would say, Ehsan, your accent is so annoying. Can you ask somebody else to just read it for you? So then I said, okay, this is problematic, but let's try it. But are we getting somewhere with these questions? We already said that down here, up there, front, back, up, down, right? So we talked about two different points in a space already. And we also experienced the temporal simultaneity of the thing about my wonderful accent and your laughter, which probably talks about time. So is it possible that you say space and time are the inescapable horizon upon which everything else is possible, right? Can you imagine an experience that you can't talk about it without a space or time? So, but does it have anything to do with art or the topic of this lecture? Am I trying to build an argument here? Am I trying to reshape a concept perhaps? Or craft an idea for you guys? Who are you after all? Are you just listening or are you part of this, participating? Or maybe co-authoring with me? As you might realize, one of the exciting moments in this class is the moment that Professor Ernst calls your name, say, tell me something about your journal. And then you start talking about that, and he reflects on what you said. So there's a kind of dialogue. Then the question is that, are you part of this construction? So are you an audience or a participant? So it is not only exciting because you get double credit for that journal, but because you become part of this lecture in a way. Things apparently might get more complex here because raise your hand if you did a recitation over last week or you're going to do it in your section. Who did recitations? Okay. On the one hand, we have the content of the poem that you recited, which was about apparently an idea or emotional, sensuous, spiritual thing inside it. Call it content. On the other hand, there was a form which those ideas have been represented in that particular form of your poem. Then somebody here, I guess, raised this wonderful question, or rather frustration with the idea of translation. What was that? Who did that? Who asked that question? Translation problem. It's here. So let me remind you. It says that it's not about translating from, say, Persian or Arabic to English, or is it more interesting, translating from English into English? Say when you have a poem, you want to tell your friend what is it about. The problem will start, right? Because the minute that you want to explain it, it is a disaster. You say, okay, this is a love poem. What else? Because you have to only put it in those terms, in that form, that it makes sense. Otherwise, you know, it's no longer the poetry. There was something also interesting about that recitation. What was about the way that some people did it? Do you remember how did they do it? What was the most striking part? Wasn't it interesting that a couple of you guys, some here and one here, I remember, you guys did it as if it is a song to sing it, right? As if it has a melody and rhythm. You start to do something with that. So then there was another form layered on the form of poetry itself, and then another perhaps emotional content layered on top of that, right? We can say that there was this movement from text to voice, but also body. If you remember, a friend of yours was like, following a beat, something like that. Isn't it interesting? Is the medium now text or something else? Can we call this, and we can add theater, we can add performance, we can add lots of other things here. Can we call then this system a style of representation? Is it a system now? Right? It is no longer just text or poetry with particular form, but way more complex thing. Now, this is still better. Can we call this Islamic art? Are we done with the lecture? Think about this. Professor Ernst talked about the distinction between Islamic and Islamicated. And let's see what we have here. So you move from text to voice and body. So Islam and Islamicate. Do you remember that? This guy, Marshall Hudson, in that book, The Venture of Islam, Volume 1, actually used that distinction. Anybody remembers that? What was the difference between Islam and Islamicate? So let me say something. Many of the poems, but let me go back, not distracting. Many of the poems that you have selected was about wine and beauty, right? And love. Interestingly, there was no reference sometimes to God, religion, or Islam. How wine poetry can be Islamic? And you were asking this right question, right? More fascinating, perhaps, was the fact that some of the pieces were selected were in English translation of wine poetry. So no more Arabic, the language of Quran, English, not about prophet or anything like that. Wine. Why Professor Ernst said, let's do that. Think about this. Say a Christian or even a non-believer American student or a student here in this college reciting an English translation of wine poetry, which some theologian might call it apostasy. Here as part of this class. But perhaps the only Islamic thing about this was the title of the course, Islamic Civilization. And that itself has been already problematized by Professor Ernst because he was arguing, what do you mean by civilization? Is it one thing? How we can call it Islamic civilization? When was this civilization? Where was this civilization? So things are complicated. Then the question is that, can we still call what you did Islamic art, or shall we call it Islamic art? Can you help me with microphone? If you want a moment of relief from my way of talking and helping yourself with reading this, can somebody volunteer to read it for me if it is legible, please? Who wants to do that? Yes, please.
In studying the history of Muslims, obviously, we need distinct terms for the religious tradition on the one hand and for the more inclusive civilization on the other. Unfortunately, we have not had such terms in the past. The terms Islam and Islamic have often been used in both senses, but these two terms are clearly appropriate owing to the realm of religion. If we speak in this work of Islamic art or literature, then we'll be referring to religious art or literature within the traditions of Islamic faith, in the same sense as we refer to Christian art or literature. We will require a different term for the cultural traditions of the civilization at large, when we are not restricting our reference to religion. The various peoples among whom Islam has been predominant and which have shared in the cultural traditions distinctively associated with it may be called collectively Islamdom, as forming a vast interrelated social nexus. The distinctive civilization of Islamdom then may be called Islamicate. Okay.
Thank you. Thank you. Isn't it interesting? Now, if this is Islamicate, why we can't call what you did Islamicate art? Right? Can we do that? Was it the legitimate thing to do? What was bounding all of us to say that that was Islamic art? So, thank you, Jay, and thank you for reading that. So, let me get to actually Greek mythology. Greek mythology, you remember that these goddesses and gods and their endless battles, right? We know well-known figures like Apollo and Dionysus and their contrast, but there are some lesser-known ones that are important to our discussion. One is Ernst and Nasrenius, each following a particular view, and I bet that you know one of them already. The god of essence, the one at the left, Seyyitos and Nasr, claims Islamic metaphysics and theology, quote, sees the origin of all forms in God. For he, the God, is the knower, capital K, of all things. And therefore, the essence of forms of all things have their reality in the divine intellect. So what he's saying that everything that we see is coming from God. There is an essence in everything, in every beauty, perhaps, right? So he's an essentialist. And the other guy opposes that. He said in the class, I think in the second session, if I'm right, everything that has a history doesn't have an essence. Well, we should think about that, whether that's correct or not. Which one is, why the arguments are different and what is the benefit of each. So Nasr actually continues, the origin of Islamic art must be sought in the inner realities or haqiqat of Quran. The origin is in Quran, which are also the principal realities of the cosmos and the spiritual reality of prophetic substance, meaning Prophet Muhammad and his sunnah, if you wish. So he continues, Quran provides the doctrine of unity, while the Prophet provides the manifestation of the unity in multiplicity. Is it interesting? What does that mean? So unity of God, Allah is one, and everything returns to that. But there are multiple manifestations of that unity. So there is an essence there, but there's multiplicities. So this is important because it says there is an essence to form or forms of all things. There is one essence. And he says that I can't find it. Where he can find it, he says that I can't find it in Quran and in Prophet. Interesting. How you can find, for instance, essence of beauty if, say, this chair is beautiful, which I doubt. How do you find it in Quran, according to him? How do you find the principles of beauty in those terms? So let's see what does Nas says about this? So this is Persian pottery, and it's decorated, right? But what are the figures inside it? You see that there are figures which doesn't have Islamic, view, perhaps. But what is Islamic about it? Do you see anything interesting there? Anybody? What is Islamic there? Do you see anything Islamic there? Yes.
Like the geometric figures.
Geometric figures. But what is precisely? But what is that geometric figures? What of the art forms that Professor Ernst was constantly talking about, and it had something to do with text? What is the age condition? Anything familiar to your eyes?
Does that have to do with ring structure?
Ring structure. Very interesting point. Yes, please.
Are you talking about calligraphy?
Right? Isn't it interesting? Is this kind of ring, kind of edge condition is a representation of calligraphy? Who calls, do you remember this? Let's jump out of what we were doing. Do you remember this? What is that? From a kind of, a spiritual piece to, anybody knows that? It's I'm sorry for this obscenity, but it should be familiar to guys when they go to, he put that in the art museum, so he called it piece of art. So we should ask who calls something art? How museums, how art patrons of art, the people that wanted to sell art, originally in 17th and 18th century, start to use objects. These kind of, look at this. The first time that art appeared in Oxford Dictionary, the Oxford Dictionary is wonderful. It finds the first moments that the term appeared in history. It's just unbelievable what they do. So 1855, middle of 19th century, the art started finding its kind of contemporary meaning. The first object of an artist is to gratify the feeling of taste or the proper aesthetic emotions. So the question of beauty. An established form taken by a work of art as a novel, concerto, portrait, film, etc., an artistic genre. Again, middle of the 19th century. Is it first necessary to prove the nothingness in the detection of the error already stated of the art form opera? So art form becomes something. Before that, what was it? Just 15, 20 years before, it was artifacts. That dish, that bowl was an artifact. People were using it, they wouldn't call it art, right? The same way that, think about it, they had these practices, rituals, they were not calling it religion, right? So we should be suspicious these techniques of articulating the age and having a narrative inside that is symbolizing something, is familiar to you, and it's a technique. Then, if you just use this technique for doing something else, and you kind of start reducing the literal symbolization of animals, people, etc., because the point is now about God, about the spirituality, about the image of heaven. So you don't want to show some people necessarily, but certain patterns. But look at, again, the presence of calligraphy, as Sama said, and the idea of articulation of age and repetition. If we turn this one upside down, what is the form? And if we enlarge it, kind of scale it up. Say a bowl, turn it upside down, scale it as big as this. What is the name of that? A dome, excellent. Isn't it interesting? Right? So what is shaping work of art is not necessarily a specific principle, but the technique, the craft, the certain aesthetic which is rooted in a tradition of making objects. Later on, religion just touched on certain things, said, okay, let's use patterns on the structure of this dome. But again, see, what you see this, where is calligraphy? Do you see it? I bet you see, right? Look at the edges. The Quranic calligraphy. All right, so going back to Nasr, he says there is this truth, absolute truth, essence of the thing, meaning unity of God. And then, so that's center of everything. And then you have external manifestation of it, which is multiplicitous, meaning that we can be part of that. Although I should exclude myself from the idea of beauty and all of that, but we can be apparently part of that. But then the question is that if all is created by God, do we have an idea of something not beautiful? And how does that fit in Nasrian essentialist, perennialist ideas, right? How we justify suffering. You see the problem with that definition. Now, if you want to say, okay, Nasr, you say something which is interesting. You say that there is essence and this idea of center, right? And you said the idea of ring and things like that, this idea of centrality and this repetition of things. What is this image? You know it. Somebody at the middle tells me, what is this? Yes, it's Kaaba. Meaning, what was it originally? In Mecca, there was this pavilion that all of these idols were there and prophets were there. We call Prophet Muhammad iconoclast. He broke them up. This was an Abrahamic, thing, tradition. So he said, this shouldn't be anything inside it. God is not here. Don't try to find it. So then it became the center for prayer in all Muslims. Don't call it even the world, for all Muslims. So if I'm a Muslim and I want to pray, where should I turn? To this, right? So I should find a way to turn myself and do the prayer toward that. So as Professor Ernst showed you, lots of science developed through how to find it. Astrology helped, you looked at the direction of. So what is happening then in the structure of cities? You see this piece down here, right? What is this? What is the type? A mosque. Good. So a mosque. You see that the mosque is tilted. Why it is tilted? Should be easy. Why it is tilted? Face Kaaba, right? So if you look at any place for prayer, it should be turning that way if you want to be, essentially. So there is this, way to find it, and you are allowed to do it, right? Then you say when it is center and spirituality, what the hell this is doing at the center? What type of art it is? Again, think about multiple ways of thinking about spirituality in the Islamicated forms, right? Which was close to the idea of poetry and wine. So if you ask Nash, is this Islamic art? Probably would say no. But actually this was part of his book. But if you ask Professor Ernst, is it Islamic art? It is Islamicated art, yes. Because it's coming out of that tradition of that encounter of culture and religion. So look at this citadel. You see this kind of military fort. What does it remind you? Is it a citadel, right? What is interesting about it? Any thoughts? People hiding back there, right? So, but it turned out actually, what these people are doing, all they're trying to get in, huh? Does that make sense? They're invading the citadel. It turns out that actually that's the mosque in Mali, and rain washes it because it is made of clay, and every year there is a ritual. They clear it again. They rebuild the mosque constantly. How this is a mosque? Where all of those, and this is the interior, where is all of those calligraphy, symbolism, tile work is going? Center, looking at Kaaba. Look at these people. After that ritual, they are praying. Look at their directions. They are apparently looking all to Kaaba, right? But look at this guy. Oh, sorry. The one here. Hey, others are looking the other place. Or, just random. I mean, look at this one. Perfect. So are we allowed to say, well, you guys are doing it wrong? Are we allowed to say this is not Islam? Or this is Islam? Or this is Islamic art? Another example with the same typology, with the same plan. This is in Cordoba. And you see this has been turned toward Kaaba. But again, thinking about that bowl and that technique, you see these double arches, right, on top of each other? You say, how Muslims found that form? Where did they found that? Where it's coming from? It turned out that it's coming from Roman aqueducts. Aqueducts are these infrastructures. They were leading water to the city, to Rome, because they didn't have, clean water, so they needed to bring it from far away, and so they needed to raise it high enough so water could fall on top of it, right? And that technique, they used it at the same as pottery. The same technique have been reappropriated for something that we certainly, this is absolutely Islamic art. So what I want to think, now we have more vocabulary perhaps, think about this, right? Now we have the idea of function. A bowl does something, but its beauty is also shaped by aesthetic judgment, by something else. The audience, me that I'm using it, have some taste, have some expectations. The patronage, somebody is buying it from me or paying me to do that, to create that object. So it is always important to think about who is defining something, who is saying this is Islamic art or this is not. Think about that time of 18th century when I showed you the Oxford Dictionary's emergence of the word term art. You think about that time, Darwin also was classifying a species. The obsession with putting things in classification. But what is the problem? Think about the implication about gender. Think about the implication about race. Where do you define somebody and judgment about aesthetics, beautiful or ugly? Where do you define somebody European or Eastern? When you define somebody man or woman and nothing in between? Where do you define somebody black or white? So I think it's important that through art, actually, we are capable of raising so many more questions. The idea of Islamic art whether colonialists have defined that for us, that we have this idea of kind of Orientalist notion of Islamic art or Islamic mosques. Everything that we showed that is creating some interesting questions, right? Now my question is that if we want to turn this room into a mosque, what shall we do? Is it possible that we turn this room, for example, into a mosque? How?
By treating it as a mosque.
So how that can be possible?
Just simply by, acting in such a way as you would act as you would in a mosque. You make a room into a mosque. Its existence precedes its essence, which is defined by the human beings that use it.
A very interesting point, right? Any other ways? Do we need a kind of essential element here? Do we need a mihrab, for instance, to orient us toward? You say no, right? Yeah, probably not. Do we need anything else? Do we need a minaret so somebody goes and like calls for prayer, says that? Do we need that? Probably not. So it is so interesting when you think about something so established like a concept of mosque. Yes, it needs mihrab, it needs minaret, it needs this, it needs a dome. Nope, it doesn't. The same way that being a Muslim perhaps doesn't need any form.
Okay, but
can I have the microphone, Jay, please? Is it controversial, right? Is this problematic? Yes, let's see what's happening. I'm in trouble now, guys. I mean, help me if it was so bad.
Okay.
Yes, okay.
I was just going to say, I mean, the whole concept of you can act like it's a mosque and then it becomes a mosque is problematic because if we wanted to act like this was a gym and everybody was around panning and sweating and out of breath, it still wouldn't be a gym. I mean, there's certain elements to it. For instance, if you want to pray, though, you still have to cleanse before you pray in Muslim ritual. So you need somewhere to wadda. Where could you do that here? That also takes away the classification of a mosque. You need prayer mats, usually in a mosque. I mean, yeah, these are like classifications, but that builds the form into the classification. Classifications are there for a reason.
Excellent. Response to that, answer it. Yes. Oh gosh, we are getting into trouble.
I think that's a really good point that you raised, but at the same time, if you think back to the original picture that Ehsan showed, those guys were pretty dirty after helping build the mosque. Yeah, thanks for pulling it back up. I mean, like, they're still praying, they're still Muslims. Like, my personal take on it is it's not my place to judge somebody else based on their religion. That's their call.
Yes, go ahead. We have a fight here. That's good. Others, please help. Thank you, Jay. Sorry for you.
I agree with that on some level. I mean, what they're doing, though, is they're praying, they're outside, they're displaying being Islamic. Displaying being Islamic doesn't necessarily make that a mosque. If I were to go outside my classroom and pray outside 5 times a day wherever people pray, it doesn't mean I'm in a mosque. At the end of the day, I'm still in the classroom. I'm praying, I'm being Muslim, but that doesn't make it a mosque.
Very good point.
There's structure to classification of things. That's why they're there. It's arbitrary, and you could see it the way you want to see it, but at the end of the day, the structure and the form is what makes the classification a classification.
Very good. Counter-argument. Quickly. Yes. We are not going to get out of here. Here.
Okay, I acknowledge that point, and I understand that that is the way the world works, but I think once we start classifying religion in that way, that's when it becomes dangerous, that we start controlling people's spirituality and their essence and their existence in classifications in physical things. I think a mosque could be like a patch of grass if you really want it to be. If you're like, I'm going to pray here, this is where I'm going to like elevate spiritually. I don't think that we have to attach these worldly classifications just because some authority said this is the way it has to be.
Interesting. But maybe defend him a little bit. So he says that mosque, the idea of mosque is collectivity sometimes, that you are doing some rituals in some ways, but isn't it a collectivity already? And is the place already the courtyard of a mosque? Yes, another. Sorry, guys. I mean, we are going to come to peace.
So I'm going to defend him here.
Yes, okay.
I think you have to think about what the nature of the building is, what you want to use it for. So the nature of a mosque is to be a place.
So you mean the essence?
The essence of a mosque is to properly, and the purpose of it is to be a place to pray in the correct religious way, because you're following a religious ritual and there are certain rules that go with it. So I think if you want it to function as a place for proper religious prayer according to the doctrine, you should outfit it to be that way. So you would need some of the things for it to function.
You're essentialist. You're following, what was the name? Nasranius?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, so I will leave you here because this is a fascinating question. And we're not trying to address that, but I thought that's important to see how interesting it is. How interesting that this room have all of the things. And if you look at the history of Islam, where they didn't have water, there was another method, tayammum, meaning that any dust could cleanse you. And when they didn't have the prayer mattress, anything would work. So this kind of flexibility and openness was also a point that can make any condition, perhaps, any place, into something else. But these are interesting points.
That makes everything arbitrary. Like that chair has 4 legs. Can I call it a cat? That doesn't make it.
Well, artists do. Artists do. That's the point. Particularly interesting. That's an excellent point because that's what artists do. Artists, in an anthropomorphic way, they say anything is anthropomorphic. So when we see an object in an exhibition, we associate kind of like anthropomorphism into it. So yes, they call it cat. Oh gosh. All right, 2 points here. May I go with that one?
I was just going to say we live in a world based off of classification. We can't pretend that we don't live in a world that's based off of that. And if we didn't have classification,
Can you repeat it again?
we live in a world that's based off of classification, and we can't pretend that we don't. And if we want to have conversations with other people about objects, we kind of have to call that a chair. We can't call it a cat because then no one will understand our conversation.
I sit on a cat every day. That nobody.
1 point here. Interesting. I will get to you.
No, I was just gonna say to his point that even in I think it was last night's reading, Dr. Ernst was talking about you can't necessarily say, well, this is something that's Islamic art, but you can definitely say that is something that isn't. You know it more according to what it isn't as opposed to what it is. In terms of the essentialism of something.
So what's you are saying that what? Can you?
Well, like he's saying, just to his point about you can't just arbitrarily say, well, that's a mosque, so of course it's a mosque. You know what I'm saying? We can readily identify that, yeah, this isn't a mosque for so many
So my
reasons.
question is that then this kind of thing that you guys all were convinced that's a citadel, and a fortress, how then this is a mosque? How this interior or the exterior, how this is a mosque? How this interior is a mosque?
You told us it's a mosque. Maybe it's not a mosque. I mean, that's.
Okay, that's good.
That's the classic arbitrary contradiction.
Oh my gosh. Okay.
Oh, sweet. So just as sort of a counterpoint to that.
What's your name, excuse me?
Roy.
Roy will be our essentialist.
Okay.
Counterpoint to this.
Or not Roy. What's your name? Sorry.
Oh,
Madeline?
Madeline.
Oh,
Okay.
sorry. So Madeline said, we live in a world of classification.
Classifications, right?
No, we hear that.
Oh, you hear it?
Yes.
Okay, classifications, right? Rather than living in a world of classifications, I think we've grown up in a society of classifications. So in this society, in the U.S. particularly, where we've all grown up, we have all sort of gotten an established view of what a temple looks like, of what a church looks like, of what a mosque looks like. However, just looking at that picture, that obviously shows in that society they have different values of what a mosque looks like. So at the end of the day, it sort of comes down to what the people in that society believe a mosque to be, or a temple to be, or a church to be, rather than what someone else 500 miles away believes it to be.
There was another hand. I will get back to you. There's one there, and then I will get back. Sorry that I'm delaying you. Sorry, Jay, that you today have so much of exercise. I didn't know that that question would be coming.
So I have
kind
a
of
thought,
warm.
and I'm going to try and explain it. And I think a lot of what we're having trouble with coming to a consensus is because we're at two different starting points. And that's because there's this idea something is defined by the person who has authority over it, or the creator. And I think, especially since we're talking about religion, I think we can say this as there's an idea that we as humans can define what something is, or that the creator, like Allah or God, or I guess that's the same word, but has the ability to define it. And when we take God out of the picture, then I feel like it becomes completely arbitrary, because all of the humans are just trying to define this thing, which is fine, I guess, but also if you are believing in God, which I would say a lot of people who made this art do, then they're looking to that to define what the mosque is.
So you are saying this center is so important that we have to constantly get back to it in order to find a point of adherence or something? Otherwise, we are lost. That's your point?
Yeah,
Kinda?
or it's just arbitrary.
Okay, so you say it is arbitrary if we are not in the center, but we are somewhere in the periphery. You see what I'm trying to say?
Yeah.
Because if there is this, all of us, according to essentialists, are multiplicities of the representation, different manifestation of that truth. If we are not finding that center, is it still possible to be at one of these edges and say, I'm doing something?
Yeah, I would say depending on the creator, if that's real or not. If it is real, even if you are saying it depends on us, then that's actually not true. It depends on the creator.
Okay. Jay, can you see if the batteries have a problem or what? You have batteries. So can you be loud if you don't mind?
I would argue that in this case, a perspective that I would take is that objects are defined not by the intention of their creators necessarily, but by their use. What makes something as a mosque is not that it is built to be a mosque, but rather that it is used as a mosque. For the same reason that, for example, a tree stump can be a seat, even if nature did not create it with the intention of it being a seat. It becomes a seat by the action of humans sitting on it.
Wow, that's very interesting. So the use, the function of, yes, loud, please loud.
So the whole classification thing, yeah, you can classify anything the way you want it. You can get into a whole philosophical debate about it. But then let me ask this one question. Can we say that ISIS is true Islam then? Because they think it's true Islam. They look at it the way they interpret it. So does that become true Islam even though it wasn't intended to? Then that's where we say, oh, then people are going to be like, no, that's not true Islam, but then you're using classification.
That's a good point. So in a way, if you put yourself in the position of them, if you say there is an essence, and I am the one to know this essence. They say, I read Quran, that essence, and I see that is it. What is the difference of ISIS? It's a bad question. What is the difference of ISIS? But somebody that says, for example, what's that between that one and where was him? Our other God thing with this guy, because he says, I read Quran and I can extract the principles upon which you can understand Quran, Islamic art, jurisprudence, everything. who lays claim of understanding? Yes.
I would reply to that ISIS is as much of a true interpretation of Islam as any interpretation of Islam.
Okay.
There is no one interpretation of Islam. Are we going to start saying that the Shiites are wrong and the Sunnis are correct, for example, in their reading of Islam?
Do you see the issue that though? Because
yeah, of course I see the issue, but that's the issue. So in a way, do we need other criteria? For example, tolerance to be layered, and this idea of laying claim on authority, of knowing things or authenticity, so make a religion work. Is it possible? Is it the right question? What is the right question? Anybody can ask a good question here. That side, we talked about edges. The edges side. Yes, any ideas? Yes, no, you yourself, yeah, you also ask good questions. But how do you ask this question? Of the possibility of saying, well, there is no center, there is no absolute essence, so everything goes. What is the problem with that? Or what is the right answer to that? Or the claim that ISIS is as Islamic as others? Yes, please.
I was just thinking that you can't really say that everybody's interpretation is right, because if something saying that truth is relative, which that's if something is true for one person and it's true for another person in a different way, then it can't be true because they can't both be right. So only one of them is right or neither of them is right. So that's like a problem.
May I get that question very quickly?
So, my thing is it can be an interpretation, but excuse my language, but anything can be a bastardization of something else. It can be a true interpretation. So interpret the Bible to validate or legitimize their own violence. So it is maybe a true interpretation, but it is also a potential true bastardization of faith. Okay, hold on.
As soon as the words left Jesus' mouth, everything was bastardization of Christianity, because everything was just interpreted through the lenses of Christ's followers rather than through Christ himself, which we might regard as the true original Christianity. In the same way that we might say that Muhammad, even if he was more of an academical sort of individual, he was the only person to ever truly understand true Islam. If we're going to mass movements, then we have to acknowledge that there is some depth to the argument.
Okay. Very good. Thank you all very much. You have so many things to say, but thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you. That was good. Thank you very much.
Way to pull it out. Yo.